Hello. It's time to learn about muscles, or as you may pronounce it, muscles. Let's do this. Okay, so in an earlier video, you learned about the bones of the body, so I pointed out some of the major bones in your body. Let's look at some of the major muscles and muscle groups in your body. And if you're a weightlifter or an athlete, or you just exercise at all, you're probably familiar with most of these. So let's start on the left side. So right here, this is the biceps, right? So when this bad boy contracts, it lifts your arm up, moves your wrist towards your shoulder. This is your triceps. So when your triceps contracts, it moves the arm down, so it pulls your wrist away from the shoulder. The pectoralis major, often called pecs, this helps move your arm forward, so if you're punching or doing a push-up. The quadriceps, so this is a series of muscles on your thigh, and when they contract, they extend your leg forward, so kicking a soccer ball will be an example. Moving to the right side, this is your deltoid or shoulder muscle. So this raises your shoulder, like if you're flapping your arms like a bird. Gluteus maximus, right here, also known as the butt or buttocks. It moves your hip, it moves your thigh rather at the hip, so it's involved with leg movement. Gastrocnemius, which maybe you thought was called your calf muscle, really technically it's the gastrocnemius actually. And so this turns your foot downward, so if you're going to be jumping in the air, your gastrocnemius is going to contract, it's going to pull in your Achilles tendon, it's going to pull your heel up and launch you several feet into the air. And then I just mentioned this guy, the Achilles tendon. I know it's not a muscle, guys, but it's on the slide, and I think it's pretty cool. Here's your Achilles tendon, and I already talked about it. So let's move on. All right, so when we learned about tissues, we learned that muscle tissue is one of the four types, and we learned that there's three types of muscle tissue. There's smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle. And in this lecture, we're just going to focus on skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is responsible for movement. All right, you've got 700 muscles ranging from your large quadriceps to really small muscles in your face, for example. These muscles all work as a lever system. So in other words, there's one end of the muscle attached to a bone and the other is near a joint, and so when the muscle contracts, it moves this bone, and there's a joint here that allows the bones to swivel relative to one another, right? And so oftentimes these skeletal muscles come in pairs as well. So the biceps and the triceps are a good example. When the biceps contract, it moves the arm up, and when the triceps contracts, it moves the arm down. So they're kind of these alternating levers. So one muscle group moves a limb in one direction and another muscle group moves it in another direction. All right, so the rest of the lecture is really going to be focusing on how a muscle contracts, and I'm going to do my best to describe this efficiently and clearly via the medium of a YouTube video. Normally I would draw some amazing drawings on the whiteboard, but we're going to have to make do with PowerPoint by YouTube. All right, so before we can talk about muscle contraction, let's look at how a muscle is organized. So a muscle is made up of nested fibers. All right, so what I mean by that is if you look at this cross section of a muscle, so this whole thing will be the muscle. The outer side has this connective tissue that kind of keeps all of the muscle fibers in place. And then there's little bands or bundles of muscle fibers. So here in the image, they pulled out one of these muscle fibers, and you can see that this muscle fiber is made out of smaller fibers, which are made out of smaller fibers. So the smallest fibers are called myofibrils. And in fact, if you look at these myofibrils, they're made out of myofilaments, so little rope-like strings of protein that we'll talk about later. So the idea is for this muscle to contract, each of these myofibrils is going to contract, which makes the fibers as a whole contract, right? And they're going to need to be well coordinated, so they're all contracting at the same time. and contracting with an approximately equal amount of strength. All right, so moving on, before we move on, just myofibrils are like the basic unit or the smallest unit of a muscle. Every muscle is made up of bundles and bundles of myofibrils. The myofibrils are striated. That just means that when you look at them under a microscope, they looked striped. You can see that in the drawing. So it looks striped, and actually the stripes move in two directions. The stripes go left, right, and then there's also these lines that appear to run up and down. All right, and so the reason for these stripes is because this myofibril is made out of long filaments of protein, and this thing is going to contract and when it contracts, it's going to get smaller. So this edge is going to move in, and this edge is going to move in. All right, and then the unit that contracts is called a sarcomere. All right, so in other words, from about this line is called the Z line, and there's another Z line right here. When this muscle contracts, this Z line is going to move that way, and this Z line is going to move that way. So scientists gave the section in between the Z lines a name, and that name is a sarcomere. So the sarcomere is basically just the portion on a myofibril that's between these Z bands. And sometimes we say that the sarcomere is the basic unit for contraction. And what that means is when we talk about how a muscle contracts, instead of talking about the whole muscle at once, we just break it down and talk about how its smallest part is contracting. Right? And its smallest part that contracts is the sarcomere. So in other words, when a muscle contracts, each sarcomere is going to get smaller. It's going to get less wide. Right? So if this myofibril on this muscle was to contract, then this sarcomere would shorten and this sarcomere would shorten. Right? So each myofibril is made up of lots of sarcomeres end to end, and they're the units that actually contract during muscle contraction. So to illustrate how that works, I made this. This is pretty good, huh? So this is a muscle fiber. So this is similar to what we saw here, right? So technically this would be a myofibril, and you can see that fiber is just sarcomeres attached end to end, right? And again, when this muscle fiber contracts, it's going to get shorter, right? So it's not going to go from one end of the screen to the other. It's going to be somewhere in between, and it's going to do that by each sarcomere individually contracting. Right? And whoops, yep, there's some arrows showing that. So each sarcomere, this sarcomere is going to get shorter, this sarcomere is going to get shorter, this sarcomere is going to get shorter, and the overall effect will be this muscle fiber gets shorter as well. Right? And to illustrate that, imagine you've got a bunch of people. These are apparently high schoolers in a gym class because they're all dressed the same, at a prep school because they have collared shirts. But each one of them is going to be holding the rope with both of their hands. All right, so the rope is representing a muscle fiber, and then each of their hands is representing the two ends of a sarcomere. And imagine if each person just moved their hands together. So this gal moves her hands together, she moves her hands together while gripping the rope. Right? What would happen is overall this rope would shorten. Right? Hold on, I got arrows. Here they come. There they are. So they move their hands together, and the end result would be that overall the rope would get shorter. So that's what happens with a muscle fiber. The muscle fiber is like the rope, and each sarcomere functions like two hands that are squeezing each sarcomere so that it gets shorter. I don't know. I think that should make sense by now. I've repeated it like 50 times. All right, how do the sarcomeres get shorter? Well, they do it because each sarcomere consists of two proteins. One protein is called myosin, and the other protein is called actin. Actin is the more boring of the two proteins, so it kind of acts like a rope. So here's what an individual actin molecule looks like, and then they bond together in these long filaments or strands, and so a bunch of actin comes together and forms this rope-like filament. Right? And if we move down here This is the Z line and Z line, so in between is a sarcomere. And if we zoom in and look at what's happening in the sarcomere, here's the Z line, and you can see attached to the Z line are these long filaments of actin, the boring protein. See that? All right, then the more exciting protein is this guy. This is myosin. And so myosin is also put together, bonded together in these long filaments, but myosin moves. And so what happens is myosin, these little things are called myosin heads, and they can move. So they're kind of like little triggers. They can be loaded, kind of like a spring-loaded trigger, right? These things can be loaded or cocked, and then when released, they snap forward, right? And so if we go down to our sarcomere, you can see the myosin here, and here, and here. And what will happen is these myosin heads will attach to the actin. So imagine the myosin attaching to the actin here, 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 and here, 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 right? And as these heads snap, they're going to snap in a direction that pulls on the actin ropes, and it's going to move this Z line this way. And these myosin heads are going to attach to and pull on the actin ropes in this way, and it's going to move the Z line in this direction, shortening the sarcomere. So actin acts like a rope. Myosin is the protein that provides the power to contract the muscle. So it's kind of like the hands that are pulling on the rope in the earlier gym class example. And know that calcium and ATP help control myosin. You're going to see more of that in future slides. But calcium helps the myosin attach to the actin, and then ATP is going to help provide the power or the energy for loading the spring-loaded myosin heads, which are the source of the movement in the sarcomere. So we'll talk about this in more detail in the future. All right, so what triggers a muscle contraction? So if you think about it, you can contract the muscles in your hand and make a fist. Right, so what's going on there? Well, skeletal muscle is controlled by your brain, right? It moves voluntarily. And so your brain is going to send a nervous signal down to your muscles, and it's going to tell them to contract. And what's important about that is when that nervous signal, which is also called an action potential, right? Basically just a electrical signal that passes along the neurons that make up your nervous system, right? When that nervous signal from your neurons or your nerves hits a muscle, it's going to set off a chain of events that causes that muscle to contract. And what's important here is that the electrical signal from your nervous system stimulates all the parts of the muscle to contract at the same time, right? So it's kind of like, oh man, I should have thought of an example ahead of time. I'm going to just think one up real quick. So imagine instead of a nervous signal, imagine electricity. And then imagine you've got these the light switches, right? And you've got lights in a room. And what you want is when you flick on the lights, you want all the lights to turn on at the same time. In other words, you don't want the lights to turn on, the ones that are closest to the switch to turn on, and then the next lights, and then the next lights, and then the next lights, kind of creating a wave. You don't want that in a muscle because you want your muscle all contracting at the same time, because that's going to generate the most power, right? And so your muscles have something on them called sarcoplasmic reticulum. And sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to help spread out the nervous signal and ensure that the muscle all contracts at the same time. So what is the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Well, do you remember endoplasmic reticulum when we learned about cells? Sure you are. Sure you do. Sure you are. Endoplasmic reticulum is just one of those cool things that you always remember when you learn about cells because it's an awesome name. Okay, maybe not. But the point is, sarcoplasmic reticulum stores and then releases calcium ions. So it's kind of like a big bag full of calcium. And when a nervous signal hits the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it causes it to release the calcium ions all at the same time. Why do we care about releasing the calcium ions all at the same time? It's because calcium ions kick off the muscle contraction. In other words, the muscle will be relaxed until calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then as the calcium is released and it washes over the myofibrils, the calcium causes the actin and the myosin to interact and generates a contraction. All right, so calcium kicks off the contraction process. So you want all of your calcium to get released at the same time, just like you want all of your lights to turn on at the same time. So how does your muscle ensure that that happens? Well, it does that by having T-tubules embedded in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So I should have pointed out this earlier, but all this kind of yellow stuff, this is sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you can see it's on the surface of individual myofibrils. And so when the electrical signal comes in, it's going to hit the sarcoplasmic reticulum and it's going to spread out. Just like the electricity is going to spread out to the different light bulbs, the nervous signal is going to pass through the sarcoplasmic reticulum and spread out evenly and cause all of the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release its calcium ions at the same time. And that's where the T-tubules come into play. So the T-tubules are basically like little highways. And so when the electrical signal, the nervous signal comes in, it's going to zip down the T-tubule. Zip down the T-tubule, it's going to spread throughout the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so the T-tubules are just channels that allow the nervous signal to flow through the sarcoplasmic reticulum and make sure that all the calcium gets released at the same time so that the muscle will contract in unison. Here it is again, right? So this is repeating what I just said, but showing better graphic to illustrate it. So here we've got your spinal cord, and then there's neurons coming out, forming a nerve. The nerve will go from your spinal cord and attach to the myofibrils on an individual muscle, right? And then the nervous signal will pass along the nerve. It'll hit the myofibrils, and then it will spread throughout it will travel along the T-tubules, spreading out throughout the sarcoplasmic reticulum, releasing calcium, causing the muscle to contract. All right, here it is again. Here we've got our nerve coming in. Here's our myofibril. The signal is going to enter into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's going to travel down the T-tubule here. It's full of, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is full of calcium. So it's going to cause, whoops, there's the nervous signal. So the nervous signal is going to go through the T-tubules and the sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's going to cause calcium to be released. That calcium then is going to wash over the actin and the myosin. Right? So here's the actin and here's the myosin. And so the calcium is going to cause the actin and the myosin to link up or form a cross bridge. And then the trigger-loaded or spring-loaded myosin head is going to move, and that's going to pull on the actin, and that's going to cause the sarcomere to contract. All right, how was that? How are we doing? Any questions? No questions? Okay. Well, that's the end of that lecture, or that section. So the next video is going to pick up right where we left off and talk in more detail about how a muscle contracts.